thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to testify. And I want to add a little bit to what Senator Spoka and Senator Donnelly very eloquently talked about, which is our concern, and again, this is 24 senators that have signed a letter to you, concern about the current proposed EA regulations regarding access to family shelters. I don't want to repeat what Senator Spoka and Senator Donnelly have said, but I do want to emphasize, as the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Housing, this is not a new concern. There have been concerns expressed by many legislators now for the past 2 years, both about EA regulations as well as the Housing First policy in general. And I would just say, before I go into the details about some of my concerns about the regulations, it's really important to remember that when the proposal by Governor Patrick to end homelessness was proposed, this was before the fiscal crisis, this is before revenue dramatically dropped, and that has not only resulted in a decrease in funding for a whole host of programs, but has also contributed to a housing crisis where rents have gone up dramatically across the state. So even the programs out there to help place homeless families into apartments, it's much more difficult because of the high rents. I think it's very important to think about that as our homeless population has grown, that it's much more difficult to place those homeless families because of the housing market we're in and because of the fiscal environment we're in, including the fiscal crisis that has cut many state programs, despite all of our efforts to create some increases in those areas. Senator Donnelly talked about the imminent risk provision EA regulations, and I want to highlight my great concern about that as well. And I think in many ways, Senator Spoka spoke to that dynamic with the family that came to her office. I wanted to also point out that 2 other concerns in the regulations are a proposal that certain families who are not income eligible and lose their housing due to no fault of their own, I argue that they should be eligible for shelter. Second, the reference to sanitary code violations. I believe very strongly that if we're talking about moving people into housing, the same standard in terms of sanitary code violations should apply to wherever we're placing homeless families and not have a substandard for where those families are being placed. That creates a much greater likelihood that these families will be placed in substandard housing that could be much less safe, could affect their health, could affect their well-being. And because of the dynamic that has happened over the past couple of years, we know that many families are falling through the cracks. Children and families are spending nights in cars, trains and bus stations, parks with nowhere else to go. Emergency room, legal services, family service organizations are becoming burdened and overwhelmed with families denied for emergency shelter and in need of assistance. And I don't think any of us has to point out the fact that we're approaching the winter, and it's a much greater concern for all of us. As the regulations now stand, families who are at imminent risk of being in places not fit for human habitation are being forced to actually stay in places before an assessment is even considered and before shelter eligibility kicks in. Certain families who are not income eligible and lose their housing due to no fault of their own will not be eligible for shelter. And because of references to sanitary code violations have been removed as a basis for shelter, the Commonwealth is creating a system where poor people will need to choose between living in substandard housing and the street. I don't think that's the kind of social safety net we want here in Massachusetts. Now, as the Senate Chair of the Joint Committee on Housing, I continue to make the point, and Mr. Undersecretary, I know you and I have had some excellent conversations, especially given your background as the Executive Director of CHAPA, is that this administration and the legislature needs to seriously increase resources for building affordable housing. Just last week, the 2 of us were here at Gardner Auditorium with Senator Jalen celebrating the passage of a bill that's going to build 1,000 units of housing over the next 36 months for seniors, for the disabled, and hopefully for homeless families. And that's a very good initiative, that's a good step forward, but the reality is we need to dramatically increase the amount of supportive housing for homeless families and affordable housing in general across the state. Massachusetts already had a housing crisis before the fiscal crisis happened in terms of the cost of housing, especially rental housing for working class and low and moderate income families. A lot of those families now are right at the edge of becoming homeless. We need to dramatically increase spending on these programs. And I say that with great praise to the administration in increasing RAFT and MRVP funds in the legislative budget that just passed. Those are very good steps forward. But the reality is, if we're setting limits on access to shelter and not increasing dramatically the amount of housing in the state, There are going to be many, many families who fall through the cracks of that dynamic. I don't want to see that happen, especially as we approach the cold winter months. So I appreciate the administration having this hearing. As you can tell, for the many, many people here, there is great concern about these policies, and I hope we can work together to craft a compromise and make sure that going into the winter season, families are protected across the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.